Ed Yong's article on the fairy tales that predate Christianity started to introduce us to some of the methodology that folklorists and other scholars who are studying cultural practices of storytelling use to try to map the relationships and the connections between different stories and different variations on the same story. In particular, Yong's article talks about the Arna-Thompson-Uttar index, which is this massive undertaking, this attempt to categorize basically every folktale in existence. And it's really focused on grouping stories that have similar elements together. And in part, the goal there is to try to trace patterns of transmission and dissemination, so that if stories have certain features in common, we might say, well, that means that maybe one of those stories evolved from the other or they influenced each other. But foundationally, the Arna-Thompson-Uttar index is about identifying some key story elements that have been repeated and recur in many different stories across time, across space, and thinking about how those shared elements connect stories together in terms of their meaning, in terms of their significance, and what they may represent for us. So one of the ways that the ATU index groups stories together is by motif. A motif is a word that more generally we use to refer to any kind of distinctive feature or dominant idea that recurs in an artistic or literary composition. But a motif can also be used more specifically to refer to a particular recurrent story element, like an event, a particular type of character, an object with certain distinctive features, or an action that recurs throughout different versions of the same story and maybe also throughout different stories. Another term we use for this is a trope, which again can refer to any individual figurative or metaphorical expression, but more frequently we use it to identify particular literary or rhetorical devices that keep coming up throughout literature, throughout different stories, and continue to be recognizable even as they appear in the context of sometimes drastically different plots. In our next unit, we're going to be reading the Tale of Snow White, and one of the trademark recurring tropes or motifs from that story is the magic mirror. In almost every version of the Snow White story, we get an appearance of a magic mirror of some type. But the magic mirror isn't a trope that's just limited to Snow White stories. It also shows up. Beauty and the Beast includes a magic mirror. The Lady of Shalott features a magic mirror. Harry Potter has a variation on the idea of a magic mirror. So we have across stories this series of repetitions that creates connections, and every time we read a new story, we bring with us that memory of our previous knowledge, our previous encounters with that trope in other stories. And the effect gets multiplied because there are hundreds of tropes that we've identified that are cataloged in the ATU index. Yong's article mentions another popular trope, the idea of a deal with the devil. The story of the devil and the blacksmith that's mentioned in the article is one of the oldest folk tales that we still have access to, around 6,000 years old. But there are many other versions that include the same basic idea of a deal with the devil or some evil supernatural figure. Another famous one is the story of Faust or Dr. Faustus, where a man makes a deal with the devil to make a woman fall in love with him. But terrible tragedy ensues because she's trying to run away from her mother and elope with him, and she gives her mother a sleeping potion that ends up inadvertently killing her mother, and she's distraught, and then she ends up pregnant before she's able to marry Faust, and the young girl in question ends up committing suicide, and Faust is devastated because he's realized he's been the agent of all this destruction. So in that version, and this is something we see coming up many times in these stories of a deal with the devil sort of comes out victorious, and we're shown the folly of human beings trying to make a deal with the devil and think that anything good could come of it, or to think that they might be able to gain the upper hand or somehow outsmart the devil. On the other hand, some stories that feature this motif of a deal with the devil seem to run in the exact opposite direction. The Blacksmith and the Devil is a story about how the hero actually succeeds in outsmarting the devil. And again, that particular variation on the story recurs in many different tales as well. So what we start to notice here is that the problem with looking at these tropes and motifs and sort of isolating them and picking them out of each story is that sometimes that motif could be doing something completely different in different stories. We really need to think about the structure of the story as a whole. What happens in that story? What type of story is it? And this is where we add in the discussion of plot. So the plot of a story incorporates the series of events or the change or transformation or progression that takes place over the course of the story. So it's more about the form the story takes rather than the specific content. And for that reason, the study of the structure of plot is called morphology. And what folklorists have found is that not only do individual elements recur across different stories, but the same plot structures are often used and reused. And so the Arne Thompson Uttar Index, in addition to grouping stories together according to shared tropes or motifs, also identifies certain tale types, identifiable plot structures that get repeated and reused. So one thing to keep an eye out for is how these identifiable plots and motifs travel from story to story, how they change and get adapted, and why those changes are made, how it influences the meaning that the story communicates, and in particular, when we take some of these same repeating story elements, these same motifs, and embed them in different plots, how might that change the impact that they have on the reader?